The morning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like a funeral shroud as Major Robert Anderson peered through his field glasses at the Confederate batteries surrounding Fort Sumter. It was April 12, 1861, and the weight of history pressed down upon his shoulders like the stone walls of the fortress itself. Behind him, his garrison of fewer than 100 men moved with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who knew their fate was sealed. Anderson had been watching the crescents of enemy artillery positions grow stronger each day since South Carolina's secession 4 months earlier. The Palmetto Guard, the Washington Light Infantry, and other Charleston militia units had transformed the harbor into a Confederate stronghold. Yet here he remained, a Kentucky-born officer, loyal to the Union, holding the last federal position. In rebellious South Carolina, the previous evening, Confederate Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard had delivered his final ultimatum through 3 distinguished emissaries: Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen Dill Lee, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Robert Chisholm. Their message was crystal clear: evacuate the fort or face bombardment at dawn. Anderson's response had been equally clear. He would not abandon his post, as the first rays of sunlight painted the harbor waters gold. Anderson's adjutant, Captain Abner Doubleday, approached with the morning report. "Sir, the men are at their stations. We've distributed what ammunition remains, though it won't last long under sustained fire." Doubleday's weathered face betrayed no emotion. But Anderson could see the resolve in his eyes, the same resolve that had carried them through months of isolation and dwindling supplies. The irony was not lost on Anderson that he now faced his former student. Beauregard had learned artillery tactics under Anderson's instruction at West Point, and now those lessons would be turned against his old teacher. Such was the bitter nature of this brewing conflict that would soon tear families and friendships apart across a divided nation. From his position atop the fort's ramparts, Anderson could see the busy preparations at Fort Johnson, where Colonel John Singleton Moultrie's South Carolina forces had spent the night making final adjustments to their guns. The Confederate batteries at Cummings Point, Morris Island, and Sullivan's Island bristled with cannon, their dark mouths trained on Sumter like the eyes of a predator sizing up its prey. The major thought of his wife, Eliza, and their children, safe in New York, and wondered if he would ever see them again. He had written what might be his final letter 3 days ago, telling her that he was prepared to do his duty, regardless of the consequences. Those words now seemed prophetic as he watched a small boat approach from Marie's Island under a white flag. The boat carried a final message from Beauregard's aide-de-camp, informing Anderson that bombardment would commence in 1 hour. As the vessel retreated across the choppy waters, Anderson gathered his officers for what they all knew would be their last council of war. The decision had been made for them by forces greater than any single man or garrison. In 60 minutes, the first shots of America's bloodiest conflict would shatter the morning calm, and nothing would ever be the same again. At precisely 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the harbor erupted in flame and thunder. Captain George Sholter James of the Confederate artillery fired the first shot from a mortar battery on James Island, the shell arcing high over the dark waters before exploding above Fort Sumter in a brilliant cascade of sparks. The Civil War had begun. The bombardment that followed was unlike anything Charleston had ever witnessed. From every direction, Confederate guns opened fire on the isolated fort. The batteries at Cummings Point under Captain William Gibbs Hazard sent shot after shot crashing into Sumter's brick walls. Colonel William Gilmore Simms and his men at Fort Moultrie joined the chorus, their heavy guns shaking the very foundations of the harbor fortifications. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Anderson ordered his men to their battle stations as masonry fragments rained down around them. The fort's design, intended to repel attacks from the sea, proved woefully inadequate against the ring of fire that now surrounded them. Captain Doubleday had the honor of firing the Union's first shot in response, a 32-pound ball that whistled across the water toward the Confederate positions. The garrison fought with desperate courage, despite their hopeless situation. Sergeant John Carmody and his gun crew worked their cannon with mechanical precision. Even as Confederate shells burst overhead and chunks of the fort's walls collapsed around them, The Union soldiers had been reduced to half rations for weeks, their strength sapped by months of isolation, yet they maintained their posts with grim determination. As reported in the Charleston Mercury's eyewitness account of the battle, the city's residents gathered on rooftops and along the waterfront to watch the spectacle. Ladies in their finest dresses stood alongside gentlemen in tall hats, treating the bombardment like a grand theatrical performance. Few realized they were witnessing the opening act of a tragedy that would consume 600,000 American lives. Throughout the morning, Confederate shot and shell pounded the fort relentlessly. The wooden barracks inside the fortress caught fire multiple times, forcing Anderson's men to abandon several of their gun positions. Private Daniel Hawk and his comrades fought the flames while dodging falling debris and exploding shells. Air grew thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning gunpowder. By noon, the situation had become critical. The fort's flagstaff had been shot away 3 times, each time replaced by brave volunteers who risked their lives to keep the stars and stripes flying. When the staff fell for the 4th time, Private Peter Hart volunteered to restore it once. Again, scrambling across the debris-strewn parade ground under heavy fire to nail the colors to a makeshift pole. General Beauregard, watching from his headquarters, began to realize that Anderson's position was becoming untenable. The Confederate commander had no desire to massacre his old instructor and sent several messages offering terms for surrender. But Anderson, true to his oath, continued to return fire even as his ammunition dwindled to nothing. As the afternoon wore on, the bombardment intensified. Confederate gunners, many of them young men, eager to prove their courage in what they believed would be a short, glorious war, poured shot and shell into the crumbling fortress. The very stones seemed to cry out in anguish as America began its long descent into fraternal bloodshed. By the afternoon of April 13th, Fort Sumter had become a scene from Dante's Inferno. Smoke billowed from the burning barracks, while Confederate shells continued their relentless assault on the battered fortress. Major Anderson, his face blackened by gunpowder and grime, moved among his exhausted men like a specter haunting the ruins of his command. The Union garrison had been reduced to firing their cannon with reduced charges. Having exhausted their supply of cartridge bags, Captain Samuel Wiley Crawford and his men tore apart their own clothing to create makeshift powder bags, determined to keep fighting even as the walls crumbled around them. Each shot fired was now a precious commodity. Carefully aimed and deliberately placed, Private John Thompson had been wounded when a Confederate shell fragment tore through his shoulder, but he refused to leave his gun. Blood seeped through his makeshift bandage as he helped ram home another charge, his face set in the grim mask of a man who knew he was living through history. Around him, his comrades moved with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers pushed beyond exhaustion into the realm of pure will. The Confederate batteries showed no signs of letting up. Colonel Roswell Sabine Ripley's guns from Sullivan's Island had found their range, sending shot after shot through the fort's embrasures. Captain James Hamilton Halonquist's battery at Cummings Point concentrated their fire on the fort's flagstaff, determined to bring down the symbol of federal authority that had flown defiantly over Charleston Harbor for months from the city. Thousands of spectators continued to watch the drama unfold. According to contemporary accounts in the Charleston Courier, the bombardment had become the greatest spectacle in the city's history. Carriages lined the battery as Charleston's elite society turned out in their finest attire to witness what they believed would be the Confederacy's first great victory. As evening approached, fires within Fort Sumter began to spread beyond control. The wooden structures that housed the garrison's quarters and supplies had become an inferno, forcing Anderson's men to abandon more of their defensive positions. Sergeant James Chester led a bucket brigade in a desperate attempt to save the magazine, knowing that if the flames reached their remaining gunpowder, the explosion would kill them all. The heat became so intense that several of Anderson's men collapsed from exhaustion, smoke inhalation. Captain Theodore Talbot organized the evacuation of the wounded to the relative safety of the casemates, the stone-vaulted chambers that offered some protection from the Confederate bombardment. Here, in the suffocating darkness, the Union soldiers tended their wounded, and prepared for what many believed would be their final night. Anderson himself had not slept in 36 hours. His uniform was torn and stained, his eyes red from smoke and fatigue, but his resolve remained unbroken. He moved among his men, offering words of encouragement and checking on their positions. Even as Confederate shells burst overhead in spectacular displays of fire and metal, the major knew that surrender was inevitable. But he was determined to extract every possible honor from their hopeless situation. His men had performed magnificently, under impossible circumstances, and he would ensure that their courage was recognized even in defeat. As night fell over Charleston Harbor, the guns finally fell silent, leaving only the crackle of flames and the groans of wounded masonry to break the eerie quiet that followed 34 hours of continuous bombardment. Dawn, on April 14th, 1861, revealed the full extent of Fort Sumter's devastation. The once proud fortress now resembled a medieval ruin, its walls pockmarked by thousands of Confederate shot and shell. Smoke still rose from the smoldering barracks as Major Anderson surveyed the damage with the methodical eye of a professional soldier assessing an impossible situation. The Union garrison had fired nearly 1,000 rounds in response to the Confederate bombardment, but their ammunition was now completely exhausted. The men had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days, surviving on hardtack and whatever water they could collect from the harbor. Several soldiers showed signs of smoke poisoning, their faces pale and drawn from breathing the acrid air that filled the fort's interior. Captain Doubleday approached Anderson with the morning report, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of battle. "Sir, we have no serviceable ammunition remaining. The fires have consumed most of our supplies, and 3 of our guns are out of action." He paused, studying his commander's weathered face. "The men are asking what we should do." Anderson nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken question. Kentucky honor ward with his military pragmatism as he considered their options. They had defended their post with distinction, holding out far longer than anyone had expected. No one could question their courage or dedication. But continuing the fight would accomplish nothing except the needless sacrifice of his men's lives. From the Confederate lines, a boat approached under a white flag. General Beauregard was once again offering terms for surrender, but this time his proposal carried the weight of inevitability. Anderson knew that his former student was being generous in victory, allowing the Union garrison to surrender with full military honors rather than demanding unconditional capitulation. The negotiation party consisted of Colonel Louis T. Savant. Wigfall recently arrived from Texas, along with Captain Stephen Dill Lee and Colonel James Chestnut, Jr. These Confederate officers climbed through a shell hole in the fort's wall and found Anderson waiting for them in the parade ground, surrounded by the debris of 34 hours of bombardment. Major Anderson, Colonel Wigfall, began formally. "General Beauregard offers you the opportunity to surrender this post with all the honors of war. Your garrison will be permitted to salute your flag, and you will be provided safe passage to any port in the United States." The terms were remarkably generous for a military surrender, reflecting both Beauregard's respect for his old teacher and the Confederate desire to begin their new nation with a display of magnanimity. Anderson's response was measured and dignified. He would accept the terms, but requested permission to conduct a formal ceremony of surrender befitting the gravity of the moment. His men had served with distinction. He was determined that their final act would reflect the honor they had brought to their flag. Throughout the siege, as documented in Harper's Weekly's detailed coverage of the surrender, the arrangements were quickly agreed upon. The Union garrison would be allowed to fire a 50-gun salute to their flag before lowering it for the final time. They would march out with their personal weapons and equipment, and transportation would be provided to New York aboard a vessel of their choosing. The white flag was raised over Fort Sumter at 2:30 in the afternoon, formally ending the bombardment that had opened America's Civil War. As news of the surrender spread through Charleston, church bells began to ring throughout the city. The Confederates had won their first victory, but the cost of that triumph would soon become apparent as both North and South prepared for a conflict that would dwarf anything they had yet imagined. The morning of April 15th, 1861, dawned clear and cool over Charleston Harbor. Inside the battered walls of Fort Sumter, Major Anderson and his exhausted garrison prepared for the ceremony that would mark the end of their heroic stand and the beginning of something far larger and more terrible than anyone yet imagined. Anderson had spent the pre-dawn hours writing his final dispatches to Washington, carefully documenting the events of the past 3 days for posterity. His report would reach President Abraham Lincoln within days, carrying news that would transform the rail splitter from Illinois into a war president and galvanize the North for the struggle ahead. The Confederate authorities had granted Anderson's request for a ceremonial surrender with full military honors. At noon, the Union garrison would fire a 50-gun salute to their flag before lowering the stars and stripes for the final time. It was a gesture of respect between professional soldiers, but one that would have consequences neither side could foresee. Captain Doubleday supervised the preparation of the artillery pieces for the salute. The men worked with quiet dignity, their movements precise, despite their exhaustion. These same cannon that had defied Confederate batteries for 34 hours would now bid farewell to federal authority in South Carolina with a thunderous farewell that would echo across a divided nation. Private Daniel Hawk, veteran artilleryman from Ireland, took charge of the first gun in the battery. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he rammed home the charge for what he believed would be his final shot as a United States soldier. Behind him, Private Edward Galloway and the other members of the gun crew prepared for the ceremony with solemn attention to detail. At precisely 12 o'clock, the salute began. The first shot boomed across Charleston Harbor, its echoes rolling. Back from the city's church spires and mansions, Confederate officers and men watched respectfully from their positions, recognizing the courage their opponents had displayed throughout the siege. Then disaster struck with the cruel randomness that would characterize the war to come. As Private Hawk prepared to fire the 40th round of the salute, the cannon exploded with a tremendous roar. The defective charge, weakened by moisture in the humid harbor air, had created a premature ignition that turned the ceremony of honor into a scene of tragedy. Hawk was killed instantly, becoming the first casualty of America's Civil War. Private Galloway was mortally wounded, his body broken by flying metal fragments. Several other soldiers were injured in the explosion, their cries of pain breaking the solemn dignity of the surrender ceremony. According to eyewitness accounts published in the Charleston Mercury, the Confederate forces immediately offered medical assistance to their former enemies. Confederate surgeon David Ramsey Crawford rushed to Fort Sumter to treat the wounded, demonstrating the professional courtesy that still existed between the opposing forces despite their political differences. Major Anderson, shaken by the loss of his men in what should have been a moment of dignified surrender, ordered the salute terminated after 41 rounds instead of 50. The ceremony proceeded with heavy hearts as the garrison prepared to lower their flag and march out of the fort they had defended so gallantly. As the stars and stripes came down from its battered flagstaff, Anderson carefully folded the bullet-riddled banner with his own hands. This flag, which had flown defiantly over Confederate Charleston for 3 months, would travel with him to New York and eventually back to Washington, where it would become a powerful symbol of Union determination. In Southern defiance, the tragedy of Private Hawk's death cast a shadow over what the Confederates had hoped would be a bloodless victory. Instead of ending the crisis through negotiation and compromise, the bombardment of Fort Sumter had drawn first blood and created martyrs for both sides to rally around in the dark days ahead. The news of Fort Sumter's surrender reached Washington. On April 15, 1861, just as President Lincoln was finishing his morning correspondence, Secretary of War Simon Cameron burst into the president's office with a telegram from Major Anderson, his face grave with the implications of what had transpired in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln read the dispatch twice, his angular frame folding deeper into his chair as he absorbed each detail. The assault on federal property that he had feared and tried to prevent had finally occurred, and with it came the terrible responsibility of deciding the nation's response. The rail splitter from Illinois now faced the greatest crisis in American history, and his next decisions would determine whether the Union could survive. Within hours of receiving Anderson's report, Lincoln called an emergency cabinet meeting. Secretary of State William Henry Seward, who had long advocated for compromise with the South, now found himself arguing for immediate military action. Mr. President, Seward declared, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability, "They have fired upon the flag. There can be no turning back now." Treasury Secretary Salmon Portland Chase, the ambitious former governor of Ohio, supported Seward's position with characteristic bluntness. The Confederate attack had unified Northern opinion in a way that months of political maneuvering could not achieve. Chase argued that the administration now had the moral authority to call for volunteers and begin mobilizing the nation's industrial might, as documented in Contemporary. Reports from the New York Tribune, word of Fort Sumter's fall, spread through northern cities like wildfire. Telegraph operators worked around the clock to carry the news from town to town, and newspaper editors prepared special editions that would sell out within hours of hitting the streets. In New York City, crowds gathered around newspaper offices and telegraph stations, demanding the latest information from Charleston. The mood was electric with righteous anger and patriotic fervor. Men who had shown little interest in the secession crisis suddenly began talking about volunteering for military service, while women organized committees to support what everyone now realized would be a war effort. The reaction was equally dramatic. In smaller northern communities, in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's hometown rallied around the flag with spontaneous demonstrations of loyalty. Mayor John Cook called for a public meeting to organize the city's response to the crisis, and hundreds of citizens packed into the courthouse square to hear speeches supporting the Union. Chicago's response was particularly significant, given the city's growing importance as a transportation and manufacturing center. Mayor John Wentworth convened the city council in emergency session and pledged the city's full resources to support federal authority. Businessman Cyrus Hall McCormick, whose agricultural machinery had revolutionized American farming, began converting his factories to produce military equipment. President Lincoln spent the evening of April 15th drafting his response to the Confederate attack. Working by lamplight in his office, he crafted the proclamation that would call forth 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion and enforce federal law. The document was carefully worded to place responsibility for the crisis squarely on the Confederate States while asserting the government's constitutional duty to preserve the Union. The president's call for volunteers would be issued the following morning, April 16th, transforming the Fort Sumter incident from a local crisis into a national crusade. Lincoln had found his cause, and the North had found its voice. The bombardment that Confederate leaders had hoped would demonstrate their resolve had instead awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial and human resources would soon be turned toward the preservation of the Union. The news of Fort Sumter's surrender raced through the Confederate States like a lightning bolt, igniting celebrations from Richmond to New Orleans. In Charleston, where the drama had unfolded, church bells pealed throughout the night of April 14th, as citizens poured into the streets to celebrate what they believed was the Confederacy's first great victory. Governor Francis Wilkinson Pickens of South Carolina declared the bombardment a complete vindication of his state's decision to leave the Union. Standing on the steps of the state capitol in Columbia, Pickens proclaimed that South Carolina had proven its willingness to defend its sovereignty against federal tyranny. The crowd that gathered to hear his speech responded with wild cheers and calls for the Confederacy to press its advantage. In Richmond, Virginia Governor John Letcher faced the most crucial decision in his state's history. Virginia had remained in the Union despite the secession of 7 Deep South states, but Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion forced Letcher's hand. The president's proclamation demanded that Virginia provide troops to fight against their southern neighbors, a request that no Virginia politician could accept and survive. The Virginia Secession Convention, which had been deadlocked for weeks between Unionists and secessionists, suddenly found itself with a clear majority for leaving the Union. Delegate John Baldwin of Augusta County, who had traveled to Washington just days earlier in a failed attempt to negotiate a peaceful solution, now rose to support secession as the only honorable course remaining to his state, as reported in the Richmond Examiner's coverage of these pivotal days. Virginia's decision to join the Confederacy transformed a regional rebellion into a true war between North and South. Virginia brought not only its population and resources to the Confederate cause, but also its military leadership, including Colonel Robert Edward Lee, who resigned his commission in the United States Army rather than lead troops against his home state in Montgomery, Alabama. Confederate President Jefferson Phineas Davis received reports of Fort Sumter's surrender with mixed emotions. While he was pleased that the bombardment had been conducted without significant Confederate casualties, Davis understood that the incident had made peaceful resolution of the crisis impossible. The former United States Senator and Mexican War veteran knew that his new nation now faced a test that would require every resource at its disposal. Davis immediately began preparations for a longer conflict than most Confederates anticipated. He authorized the recruitment of 100,000 volunteers for Confederate service and began negotiations with European powers for diplomatic recognition. The Confederate president understood that his nation's survival would depend not only on military success, but also on international support for Southern independence. Throughout the South, young men flocked to recruiting stations with an enthusiasm that amazed even veteran military officers. In New Orleans, the Washington Artillery and other famous militia units saw their ranks swell with volunteers eager to serve the Confederate cause. Captain James Barrow Hodgson reported that his battery received over 500 applications for 50 available positions. The response was equally dramatic in smaller Southern communities. In Lexington, Virginia, cadets from the Virginia Military Institute voted to offer their services to the state government, while their superintendent, Colonel Francis Henry Smith, began converting the school's curriculum to focus on military training. These young men, many still teenagers, would soon face battle-hardened Union troops in the mountains and valleys of their homeland. Confederate military leaders worked frantically to transform enthusiasm into effective fighting force. General Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter, was transferred to Virginia to command Confederate forces gathering near the strategic railroad junction at Manassas. His task was to weld together militia units from across the South into an army capable of defending the Confederate capital, which had been moved from Montgomery to Richmond. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had accomplished exactly what neither North nor South had intended. It had united both sections in a determination to fight for their vision of America's future. What had begun as a constitutional crisis over the nature of federal authority had become a test of arms that would consume 4 years and 600,000 lives before reaching its terrible conclusion.